First we have Jennifer Fitzgerald, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Scope, who's one of the largest providers of disability services in Victoria. We have Elizabeth Manning, who's lecturer in the School of Accounting, Economics and Finance at Deakin University. Philippa Angley, who was in the lockup in Canberra yesterday with the budget, so we are very appreciative of her jumping on a plane and coming all the way down to us today. She's a National Policy Manager with the National Disability Services, who has lobbied very hard for the introduction of the NDIS. And we also welcome Julie Phillips, who's the Manager of the Disability Discrimination Legal Service, a statewide independent community legal centre that specialises in disability and discrimination legal matters. So a big round of applause everybody for being here on time and all connected. Yeah. So disability care commences operation on the 1st of July, with the Barwon region being the launch site for Victoria. Agreement has been reached with the Victorian State Government that will then roll out to the other regions by mid-2019. According to the NDIS website, Disability Care Australia will help improve access to disability support by giving people with disability, including people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, more choice and control over their care and support. So let's explore that a little first. I'm going to ask a few questions and then we will start working around the regions. But Philippa, I know you've had a tough 24 hours, but if I can start with you. Your organisation's been the one really pushing for this. The Everybody Counts campaign has been a major thing. Broadly speaking, why is it a good thing?
I think most people will have some awareness of the Productivity Commission's inquiry into disability care and support. And the overwhelming, conclusion from that inquiry was that disability support right across Australia was grossly underfunded, was fragmented, was inequitable and was very unfair, and that it did not provide the resources to many people to live the lives that most of us think that they should have the opportunity to live. So I think that was the basis for, our increased energy to try and get that resolved. And NDS is a partner with Carers Australia and the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, and through that alliance they have driven the Every Australian Counts campaign, which really picked up momentum once the Productivity Commission's report was handed down. Before I go on, I'd just like to say thank you to disability service providers right across Australia who largely funded that campaign to make it happen. And I think that disability service providers have seen how difficult it is for people with disability and their carers for many, many years, and have embraced the opportunity to do something much better.
So Liz, if I can come to you next. In recent weeks the Prime Minister has announced, and this was confirmed last night in the budget, that it will be part funded through a levy similar to Medicare. From an economic perspective, is the NDIS or disability care good government policy, and why?
Yes,
That's right.
Yes, it's absolutely good government policy. I think one of the overwhelming things that came out of the Productivity Commission report and some of the other work that's been done is that it makes economic sense to invest in people with disabilities. It also makes social sense. It comes down also to choices about how we want our society to look. But from a pure money perspective, we're stuck in a system at the moment which is completely crisis-driven. That has, and the problem with that is that when someone is in crisis, there tends to be demand for crisis intervention, and without any extra funding, that takes demand away from early intervention and from respite and so on. So it's kind of setting up the next crisis. And we're in a situation where the number of people accessing disability services has been increasing by about 8% over 5 years to 2010. And basically we're getting to a position where it's unsustainable. But more than that, there have been reports done on the cost of disability. So there was an Access Economics report done in 2007. It was commissioned by Cerebral Palsy Australia, and they were looking specifically at the cost of cerebral palsy, and they were finding that if you include if you estimate the cost of cerebral palsy in 2007, including the value of lost well-being, the cost for an individual was $115,000 per person per annum, and that 76% of those costs were borne by individuals. So we have a system where huge costs are borne by individuals, and an insurance system would allow those costs to be spread thinly around all people in the country. But more than that, an insurance system will then allow investment in best practice, in early intervention, in stopping, preventing things getting into crisis. So in fact, the system becomes more efficient and less costly overall. So Access Economics actually concluded that an NDIS would be the most cost-effective way of addressing the crisis in disability care. And there are lots of, I can give lots of examples of both personal and also systemic and economic inefficiencies associated with the current system.
We might come to some more of those as time permits. But Julie, if I can come to you now, you're looking at discrimination on a day-to-day basis with the clients you serve. What is your view of the legislation? Will it actually help overcome any discrimination barriers?
Well, that's a broad question. Well, look, it will have to overcome many, I hope, because there's such a large amount of money being injected into the system, and that's hopefully got to advantage people with disabilities. However, and look, I think it's fantastic, and I should say that because I don't want to sound cynical about the whole thing, because I think it's great. But there are other systems in place that make money available for people with disabilities at different times in their life, and people with disabilities still have great difficulty accessing things like quality services. I'm thinking, for example, of attending care and some of the reports that have been done on the quality of that, and the abuse of people with disabilities in systems which are already funded. So obviously it's going to be, it's going to have many advantages, but I think there's just going to be the need for policing and advocacy to make sure that the perhaps organisations that might spring up to assist in this endeavour, and I'm thinking of, I don't know if you remember when all the autism early intervention funding was provided by the government a couple of years ago, and all of a sudden all these early intervention autism expert organisations were coming up out of the woodwork, and it was hard to know who was an expert and who wasn't, but there were many. So it's just an example of when funding was made available, service providers popped in to provide services with that funding, and there was not really any control over the quality of those services. And so I think that's another issue. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to be alert about, and I think we also need to look at some of the information from where similar systems has come and what has been learned. So I guess my short answer is, look, it'll be terrific, but there's going to have to be a lot of monitoring and advocacy to make sure that quality is provided to people with disabilities in all of these areas.
There were a number of questions in advance about the question of advocacy, so we will revisit that. But Jennifer, from a service provider point of view, you're the largest provider, a lot in regional Victoria. What changes for you on 1st of July? What actually happens? What do you need to do?
It's interesting, Maureen, I was thinking about this over the last few days, and if I think about Scope as an organisation, and hence invite people listening to think of their organisation, almost every aspect of our organisation will change. The relationship with the people we support and their families, so changing to a customer-focused engagement, where the person that we support has choice, and they will shape our services going forward. Thinking about our workforce, where the market will determine some of the services that will be sought going forward. Do we have the workforce skill set and capability to address that demand? How will we change that over time? Looking at the impact, financial impact on cash flow for organisations. We've traditionally been paid ahead of service delivery. We'll now be paid in arrears. So organisations that don't have a substantial cash reserve and the ability to manage their accounts in a timely and effective manner will be impacted upon. If I look at our brand and marketing, a lot of us work in the not-for-profit sector. This isn't an area where we've had perhaps as much focus as we will need to going forward. What will differentiate us as a quality provider when we know that perhaps for-profit organisations will come into this sector? And that's fine, I have no problem with that. We are creating a commercial market. But I do believe that the not-for-profit and public sector historically has an important value proposition that I would like to see survive in a competitive marketplace. So how will we differentiate ourselves? I think that it will become a crowded marketplace. How will people with a disability and their family discriminate? We've already talked about quality, Julie's mentioned quality, and the arrival of experts on the field who may not be tried and tested. We've also got, I guess, the tension for organisations like Scope. We're mission driven. We're here to enable people to live as empowered and equal citizens. How will we manage that and deliver on that mission when there will be a tension in terms of quality and quantity? And how will people with a disability and their families discriminate over time what it is that is the priority to them? And how will we as providers be able to ensure that we do continue to deliver on that quality? And finally, probably, because there are lots, but I'll finish on governance and risk management. From the perspective of a board, this is a very different environment that organisations like ours will be moving into. We need robust governance frameworks. We need people who have the right mixture of head and heart, who understand that we're moving into a commercial and competitive environment, but who also understand the values and history and quality of the services that have been provided by organisations like ours. And also risk management. We need sophisticated risk management frameworks and processes so that we can ensure that organisations are sustainable, that we're not going to have people with a disability and their families left unexpectedly without support and services. And I see that particularly as being a key risk that we need to identify.
The question you raised about choice, I think, has been raised by a number of people as well. And just thinking about many of the regional communities we're connecting to today and the areas they represent, how real is that choice likely to be, do you think? And you might want to comment, and others as well. In very small communities where there might only be one provider at the moment, is it really going to become competitive? A lot of, for a cost-benefit side of things, some agencies or profit organisations wouldn't even bother. So have you thought through those things?
Look, we've certainly looked at every service we currently provide. We know we will have to reorient those services. We know we will have to develop new services, and we will need to develop new ways of service delivery. So from the scope perspective, and I know Philip will speak to it in terms of the impact of thin markets and the consideration that was given to thin markets in the Productivity Commission report. But we need to look at bundling of services. We need to look at partnership with other providers. We need to use technology in a cleverer way so that we can provide service at a distance, or that we can be the expert support to a local provider. So I think that people have to be very open-minded. We have a lot of good systems and processes in the way we deliver services now. But in scope, for example, we're completely restructuring the organisation to respond to this change. And one of the positions that I have put in is a General Manager of Innovation and Service Enhancement for exactly that reason. We need to try, test and embed new ways of delivering services and support. And we need to be flexible and resilient in the way that we do that. Because I think what we need to recognise is The launch is a 3-year learning period. We will reach a more stable state over time, but in that intervening period, we have to be incredibly flexible and responsive to enable us to respond to the service choices of the people that we support. So we're wanting to put ourselves at the cutting edge. Our research plan is highly focused on the use of technology. We will be going into that space in a very determined manner in terms of the built environment. How can we use technology to enhance independence and cost contain in the built environment? But also, how can we use technology in a smart way to enhance personal independence? So I think we need to broaden our horizons. We need to have some greenfields thinking in this area.
Thanks. Just before we go to Philippa, could I just remind everyone to make sure your microphones are off or on mute in the locations until we do call on you, because we are picking up a bit of extraneous noise. Thank you very much, and welcome, Warrnambool. I see that you've joined us as well. Thanks very much for coming along. So Philippa, to you, from your perspective, the question of how real will choice be for people in particularly small communities? Do you see that as a realistic achievement that NDIS can get to?
I agree with everything Jenny has said. I think we need to just be mindful that things aren't going to change quickly from day one for many people, and that as the NDIS rolls out into areas that with smaller populations, that it'll take some time for the market to change. And even given that, there will be some areas where we never see a whole range of service providers to choose from. And I think that's one thing that the Disability Care Australia is going to have to give thought to, of how they are going to respond to that. But already across the country, we're hearing of different service responses that organisations are making. I was speaking with one of our members from Queensland just a couple of weeks ago, and they have started providing respite services to people living on remote stations, and a worker is flying in every 4 to 8 weeks and living in the homestead for a week at a time to provide respite for that family, so that the family members can do other things, including work on the property. So I think that we will see different service responses, but it will take time to develop, and undoubtedly will be probably slower in some of the rural and remote areas, just because we know that we don't have service providers there ready to go who have given necessarily the thought to new ways of providing those services. But as Jenny said, I think we'll see some real developments in the technology space that I think we haven't even thought of what they might be, but I think they are quite exciting.
And thanks for having me. The issue of eligibility is in the legislation. Probably the area that is less clear at the moment is the issue of mental health. There's still some deliberations going on in Canberra with the senior working group, ministerial interest in that, obviously. But the eligibility criteria obviously is, thank you, is around do you live in the launch site? Clearly, is one. Are you, in terms of chronological age, do you meet the launch site criteria? So 0 to 65 in the Barwon area, the same in New South Wales, 15 to 24 in Tasmania, and of course it's the children in South Australia at the moment. So, and these have been done deliberately so that we get some different learnings across those 4 launch sites. There's some issues around residency. In terms of Australian residency and citizenship are a requirement that's quite consistent with federal social security legislation, but does mean that there will be a handful of people possibly who are receiving state-based services who may not be eligible, but we are reaching agreements with the states around continuity of care. The Minister was very clear around nobody being disadvantaged. So there are people who are currently getting services, small numbers, but in terms of coming across to the launch site or continuing to get these services by way of state-based support. So those arrangements are being concluded at the moment. The definition of disability is reasonably clear, and it's in the Act. So it covers, I'll park mental health for the moment because of its current deliberations, but it's physical, intellectual, cognitive, sensory, I've forgotten the thing? Developmental, and where there's one or more aspects of activities of daily living that the disability has a significant impact on is effectively the thumbnail view of eligibility.
Yeah, I think that's the intention. There will be a lot of, there will be extra funding, as you mentioned, announced in the budget, part funded by an increase in the Medicare level and also out of general revenue through cuts into other areas. And the idea is that it will be an entitlement system, so there won't be caps, so that individuals will develop goals and whatever's needed that's considered reasonable and fair and reasonable and necessary, thank you, I was trying to think what the other word was, necessary and reasonable will be allowed under the system, and it should get rid of the waits. So if you need a new wheelchair because you're developing scoliosis, rather than having to wait 18 months and fundraise through different sources and charities and so on, by which time your scoliosis has become a lot worse, you should be able to have that as part of your goal, anticipate that you'll need it and then get it when it's needed. So there's no cap. It's based on entitlement, like unemployment benefits are once you meet the criteria. Once you've made your goals and and you have, it's a reasonable and necessary requirement, then it's covered.
Can I jump in there? Sorry. Just to clarify that, who determines the fair and reasonable?
Disability Care Australia.
Based on?
Or big criteria. We'll come to questions in a moment.
I
if
think
you don't
we
mind.
might have to hand that one
Yeah.
over to Liz.
We'll see, there will be plenty of time for questions, but I just want to come to one more because a number of people also asked this in advance, which was about advocacy, and Julie's already alluded to this. A couple of questions around that, and maybe Julie and Philippa can respond. Is there within the NDIS scheme sufficient funding for advocates, and is there an opportunity for people to have a choice of advocate? Do we know that at this stage?
Well, if you're asking me about facts, maybe someone else can answer that. But one thing I can say, and that's with my hat on as being on the board of Disability Advocacy Victoria, which is the peak body, that this is being discussed. We have been pushing for it. And I think the key word is independent advocacy outside, because that's going to be the only guarantee that there's no conflicts, etc. My understanding from the advocacy sector is that their opinion is that there is insufficient marked out, and part of that is because it's insufficient now. If you look at the advocacy agencies in Victoria, they're tiny, and I'll give you an example. My organisation is 2.6 people, and that includes all of us, and we have to cover the state of Victoria for all disability discrimination matters. And so, you know, there's your token advocacy organisations which have a name, but if you look at the staffing and their capacity and ask them now if they can cope with the advocacy cases that they have, they will say no. So clearly there's got to be a huge injection of funds if they're able to adequately assist people through this system. But who can answer exactly how much is being put aside and what the status is at the moment with advocacy? Does anyone know?
I can take a stab.
Everyone's looking at each other. Philippa, have a go.
The question of advocacy being whether it should be paid for by Disability Care Australia was something that the Senate inquiry gave quite a lot of attention to, and NDS's response to the questions we received on it has been that yes, advocacy is incredibly important and very necessary for the proper operating of the scheme, alongside adequate complaints processes and the like. However, we've been very clear that that funding for the advocacy should not be tied and should not be coming from Disability Care Australia, the agency itself, that the funding needs to come from a separate government department, whether it's FAXIA or the Attorney General's department, just to avoid those conflicts of interest and to maintain independence so the advocacy organisations don't feel at all compromised by taking complaints to an agency that was also funding them. So that's been our stance, and I understand that that's the way things will be. In the legislation for the NDIS, they make it clear that advocacy is very, very important, and it's clearly stated in the legislation. The agency itself will fund it, and that funding will come from other government departments.
Thank you. The term that's in the legislation is reasonable and necessary. It goes back to the what's relevant to the goals that are in the participants' plan. So that's sort of the foundation, I guess, cornerstone of what we would look at. There are operational guidelines that have been developed that will assist the staff and the organisation make that decision. And that's been developed in conjunction with other similar organisations. It's a legal concept. It exists in Lifetime Care and Support in New South Wales, and also in Transport Accident Commission here in Victoria, as well as the Accident Compensation Commission in New Zealand. So there's been, in terms of policy development and operational guidelines, there's been considerable exploration of what has worked and what's been developed by those organisations that do have a longer history, and where these concepts have been well tested out through case law. So it's a reviewable decision. If the participant or the person representing them believes that the decision by the organisation or the agency is incorrect, they will be able to take that through a reviewable process. But it's looking at things like, in terms of reasonable, is it the most appropriate option to meet that need? Is it age appropriate? Is it the most cost effective option over time? Not necessarily the cheapest. I need to be clear about that, because this is an insurance scheme, and we do have the ability to look at the impact of a return on investment decision. So we would be funding early intervention, be funding levels of technology and equipment and modifications to offset the otherwise ongoing cost of personal support. That is the stuff that really drives long-term costs up in a scheme that's got an insurance base. And where is the evidence? And increasingly we will be interested in building evidence-informed and then evidence-based practice. So we want to purchase more of what works and purchase less of what doesn't.
Yes, I just wanted to add that I've developed a hatred of that term reasonable. It's a term that's included, for example, in the Disability Discrimination Act, reasonable adjustments, and don't lawyers love to argue for hours on what is reasonable and what is not reasonable? Such a subjective term, so I actually haven't seen the guidelines yet, so it'll be very interesting to see how they're formed, because someone's interpretation of reasonable and another person's could be completely different.
There's a number of ways of doing this. Look, some people are well on top of this already, and effectively they will come knowing very clearly what it is that they want to do. And the discussion that will then happen with the planner assessor within the agency will be what supports do you need to achieve those goals and where are those supports coming from. However, given that this is currently a crisis-driven system, this may be the very first time that someone has been asked that question. So obviously the use of informal supports will be important. People that know and understand and care for that participant will be hugely valuable in that discussion. We need to be careful, particularly when it's adult participants and adult carers, that we understand enough about the family circumstances to represent in the plan the participants' goals, but also acknowledge the support needs of the carers. And that's particularly true, and has been an aspect of a lot of discussion with older mums and dads who have older children, adult children still living at home. So we need to be respectful of those relationships. There's an opportunity obviously to engage with us early in terms of working with a local area coordinator to start exploring what your options might be, what your goals might be. And the plan is not a plan for life. You know, if you just want to take a little baby step and start testing out and exploring some of the opportunities that previously you may not have had the ability to do so, we'll support you in that. But it's very individualised. So small steps for some people, because they've never had the opportunity to explore and learn and make choices as the rest of us have done. But other people, and I'm particularly reflecting on a conversation I had with a participant who's got a spinal cord injury. He's well on top of it. He knows exactly what he wants to do, knows exactly what supports he needs, and doesn't actually require a lot of our help to either come to that conclusion or to then bring his plan to life. But other people are at the other end of the continuum.
Look, thanks, Jenny, for that question. It's obviously something that we have been turning our minds to considerably because we work in that space to a large degree. We certainly have made submissions to government, and we are working on a project now around supported decision making for people who have complex communication needs. We know that people can express their wishes, their choices, with the appropriate support. It does require a high level of skill and understanding, and we need to see that embedded in these processes to ensure that that voice is heard. We talk, and Liz has talked about, addressing the circle of support. We know that there are people who know each other well, who understand each other's choices and needs, but we need to make sure that the central voice is heard. And we believe that one of the ways of doing this is embedding the skill set and capability around supported decision making. I'm not sure if anyone else on the panel would like to add a comment.
Julie?
Yes, I think that resources such as Auslan interpreters, and while there is not an accreditation that I know of for communication support workers currently, there needs to be some definition of an independent communication support worker in order that people with complex communication needs are not talked over. The difficulty or the challenge is that many people with complex communication needs haven't to date been provided with the equipment and the trained communication support workers to date to have developed really good communication skills to their potential. So I think in that case it'll have to be a moving feast, because if you can't communicate properly what you need, you're obviously not going to get it. But in the meantime, I think there's just got to be some quality about the people that are asked to interpret or facilitate people who aren't going to be able to verbally express their needs.
Liz, I see you were also nodding furiously there. Oh, two visits, sorry. Liz Manning first.
Yeah, I was going to say that this is going to be very important for the courts and so on as well, because I think people with disability and don't end up having a voice in the courts because they're considered unable to express or give reliable evidence, and I think that's a really important right to have, and part of being more fully engaged and protected by society. And also, I know that while there is some fantastic technology around and anyone can communicate with the appropriate supports, the appropriate supports are not just the technology though, they're also the ongoing training, help, modelling and so on that enables that technology to be best used as well.
Liz Cairns, did you have something to add?
I think just to reiterate what Julie was saying, there's no magic wand for the 1st of July. This is really significant social reform, and attached to that is really significant sector development as well. So I think it's absolutely understood that there are significant gaps that need to be addressed, and that requires a whole sector approach.
Well, actually, I was hoping that we could answer it in a two-part. What the actual answer is, I don't know. But one of the things that I was going to say is that being an insurance company, I guess there's a little bit of suspicion about any internal reviews, because insurance companies, like to save money for a number of reasons. And I guess it links back into the advocacy. I have seen, there is a graded process that I have seen, I just can't remember it, which is if you're not happy with this, you do that, da. But I think you're right that it needs to happen very quickly, because it's like taking on legal cases. 3 years later, you might get a result, but it's actually too late. So I think that it's vital, and it links in with advocacy. But as to the actual steps, does anyone remember them?
I can tell you what it is today. It doesn't mean it's going to be like that tomorrow. Obviously, the desire is to resolve these things as quickly and as locally as possible. So there is an administration process whereby someone who is more senior in the organisation would conduct an administrative review, and that decision can be then changed at that point. If the person, and that would, I can't recall the timeframes, but they will be literally a short number of working days for that process to be completed, assuming we've got all the information that we would need to have to complete that comprehensively. If the person is still unhappy at that process, they can then go to more of a formal review process, which currently is a panel. I'm certainly not aware that the issue of the ombudsman that you've spoken about has been put in place at this stage. That's not to say that it wouldn't happen in full swing, and I think if you think about a national approach to complaints and safeguarding and quality, what we have committed to in the launch sites is a continuation of the existing state-based processes. Now that's clearly for the purposes of launch, for the period of launch. Now if you think about a national rollout, which the governments have signed up to and are committed to, you can't run a state-based approach to quality and safeguarding or complaints management. So over time, the intention of the agency is to literally identify best practice as it exists right across the jurisdictions, pull that out and build a national consistent approach. It makes no sense that if you're living in South Australia, you have to go through a different process and you have different quality and safeguarding aspects than if you're living in Barwon. But that will be the case. That's the agreement that's in the intergovernment agreement and in the bilaterals, that for the period of launch, for the launch sites, we are working with the current state-based practices. I'm going to share this question with Jennifer, so I can talk to you about, from the agency point of view, a provider to be paid by the agency. No, look, I'll backtrack. Participants will have options. Some of them will choose to manage their own plan. They will effectively take the money and they'll make some choices about what they go and do with that. And the direct relationship then exists between them and whomever they choose to engage as a service provider. They will then need to acquit back to us, the participant will need to acquit back to us by way of a statement, but effectively the contractual and the purchasing arrangements are solely between them and whoever they choose to engage. We anticipate a very small number of people will want to do that initially, although we hope that that will increase over time. So if you look at the most developed and individualised self-directed funding model, which is probably the UK, still at this stage, well over 10 years in, less than 30% of people have chosen to do that. So I looked at the ISP figures in the Barwon launch area. There's just short of 1,000 people on individual support plans. Only 22 of those people currently are truly self-managing, self-directing. And about another 60 are going through a financial intermediary agency, which in the agency legislation is a plan management organisation. So clients have the ability to self-manage, to take their package and their plan and go to a plan management organisation and have that done on their behalf, or choose to engage the agency to do that. So what would happen is the agreed supports and the agreed providers is elected by the client, the participant. We then load that on in the IT system, and the provider who has been elected to by the client to provide all or some of those services then gets visibility against that, and they then can lodge an invoice, and that invoice will be paid against that approval cost centre or cost line, and payments made within 2 working days.
Thank you. Jennifer?
I think it's an excellent question, one that I think the sector is turning its mind to very seriously. I think there are 2 components to it. One, you mentioned the back office cost. That needs to be transparent in the costing of services. I think that the customer will expect to know what they are purchasing. I think that the sector needs to look at evidencing best practice in that matter. So, for example, we are benchmarking at a state and now a national level, our back office of services, so we know where we can sit and we can evidence that to a customer in terms of our service efficiency. In terms of the cost of services, I think we now need to take a very much a customer-focused and a customer-assistive approach, where we would look at options of bundling of services, of options around service delivery models, in terms of where those services might be delivered. Are they delivered one-to-one or in a group setting? Are some of them delivered at distance, so that we maximise the opportunity for the person to achieve the outcomes they're seeking against their goals? So I think it is from the service perspective, provider perspective, it's really the two elements: being transparent about what your costs are and optimising the outcome for the person in terms of being very flexible in the service delivery models and having those costed at a very sophisticated level and real-time level, so that people can make informed decisions.
I'll take the first bit. I guess there's a lot of what is acknowledged is there's a lot of unknown, and that is the absolute reason why the launch sites have been constructed and developed and set up as they are. They look different, they operate differently, and that's been a very deliberate decision by the states and by central government, so that we do get those learnings. The other aspect I'd like to comment on is the requirement of the agency to really understand the full cost of an individual support need over the entire life of that individual, and also aggregated up by way of specific client cohorts, and understand what makes a difference in terms of improving and maintaining that individual's independence and participation both in community and employment, and the consequent impact on what would be the need for otherwise funded services over the life of that individual. They are things that you simply wouldn't want to know, wouldn't want to ask, and haven't been asked when you're dealing with a rationed healthcare system. If you ask that information, you then have an obligation to do something with that. So when you're working on a 12-month or 3-year contract basis, they're short of the work that the PC Commission did and the earlier report that was referred to by Access Economics. The current funders just simply haven't had the ability to ask or understand that information or collect it. And because it hasn't been collected, there's a whole lot of things that we yet don't know, and that is the purpose of the launch. There's going to be extraordinary demands on the organisation to collect a level of information and analyse that simply hasn't happened to date, and that will inform the ongoing rollout.
So this money, I guess, back to the economics, it's a 0.5% levy, which is a partial funding at the moment. If we do reach this goal of being able to meet all these needs, what is it going to mean?
Okay, well, my tried answer to the initial question was going to be slowly. And as Liz has said, you know, that's the sort of thing that will become more apparent. But I also want to make a comment about that for a lot of people with disability, it's not really, in some ways, rocket science what they're likely to need. The courts make judgments about this when there are the very, very rare compensations that go through. So there are ways of anticipating needs over a person's lifetime, which Liz has spoken about. In terms of the economics of it, there have been several reports on outcomes for people with disabilities in Australia, and this goes back to one of the earlier things that I'm very interested in, that I was talking about. It's the costs of not doing something. So in terms, and you mentioned the workforce and labour force and so on. So at the moment, 31% of people with disabilities participate in the workforce, compared to 83% who don't have disabilities. And that's one of the worst outcomes in OECD countries. Outcomes for poverty in OECD countries, Australia is about the worst. So 45% of people with disability live in or near poverty, compared to 22%, which is the OECD average. And there are other costs associated with that. Female carers have a 50% chance of a major depressive episode. Wellbeing amongst carers is the lowest in the country. Primary carers, 71% of whom are women, are likely to be in the poorest 2/5 of households, and so on and so forth. Against that, we have the productivity, the price report done by PricewaterhouseCoopers in 2011 that said that if Australia could achieve employment outcomes at the level of the top 8 OECD countries, then there would be an extra $50 billion of GDP that could be generated by 2050. So about 1.4% contribution to GDP. So this is a system, going back to Maureen's initial question, that makes good economic sense. And I think helping to get more people back into work is good for health and well-being, and it also makes good financial sense. There will be people that won't be able to do that, but their carers may be. That we may be able to help carers to get back in. So overall, you should see an increase in participation amongst carers and people with disability, and that will help mitigate some of the other costs. So even if you don't think about it from a human dignity and human rights perspective, it does make economic sense.
Accommodation is an absolute understood gap in the system. Whilst the scheme hasn't been funded to make the capital investment, there is an expectation, and it's been built into the costings, that there needs to be sufficient in an individual support package that would encourage more innovation and more players into that market. Some of the practical development fund initiatives that are coming to fruition now have addressed that, the issue of accommodation in particular, and it's an area that will require a lot of innovation, and I think in itself probably requires a strategy too. I know the numbers here. There's been some good inroads through the YIPRAC initiative, which of course now has come to an end. But straight away, we've got close to 40 people in the Barwon area who have an immediate pressing need. Now, they're only the ones that current state departments know about. And as we go out and have, over the next 12 months, and have conversations with families and participants, that number will increase. And it's going to be a very real challenge. It's a very hot button for the Minister at the moment, and certainly it's well on the radar. But we're talking about years and years of underfunding in that infrastructure. And again, this is something that I don't think realistically can be turned around in a very short space of time. Suffice to say that it is an absolute priority area for the agency.
And Jennifer?
I'll take it from the provider end. Historically, I think you and myself and many of the people in the room who've worked in the sector over a period of years witnessed deinstitutionalisation, and we moved to essentially in Victoria a bed-based model of supported accommodation, so 5-bedroom homes, where people who became eligible for a supported accommodation awaited really an available bed in a house. In Victoria, the largest provider of supported accommodation is government through the Department of Human Services. From the perspective of a provider, we would own and operate around 67 sites across Victoria. We know that infrastructure is ageing. Often it wasn't purpose-built. It doesn't meet the needs of people whose support needs are changing over time as they age. We know that it's time to do things differently. We certainly are spending a lot of time working with property developers and affordable housing groups to look at how we can mainstream accessible accommodation for people with a disability. So we need to incentivise new developments, whether they be keyring developments, whether they be low-rise apartment developments or high-rise apartment developments, to ensure that components of those are built to platinum standards. That means standards that are accessible and suitable for people with high support needs. And we want those to be blended. We don't want people living in isolation. So we want to start negotiating with property developers that at least 25% of those developments would be accessible property. Now, people think traditionally, and I know our houses are not saleable on the open market. We've customised them to a high level. But we need to now develop property options, whether they be still in 5-bedroom houses or whether they be in apartments where we provide services into an apartment block. They need to be attractive on the open market. We know we have an ageing population. We know that if we build to platinum standards, that will enable an ageing couple to also access such a property, and that it's quite attractive to them. So we need to start having these debates with developers, with government, and actually unpack and understand that it is an attractive option in an ageing population. It will meet the needs of people with a disability, and we need to really challenge what we think is true inclusion and quality in supported accommodation. I think we're just on the cusp of that now, and I think that's very exciting. And I think that the supported accommodation innovation grants were one way of addressing that. I think we need to take that further, and I think people with a disability need to have clear control of voice in that process. I'm determined, and I think the sector, as Philippa alluded to at the beginning of her commentary, that it will deliver better outcomes. That's the whole purpose and intent. I'm often asked when I talk to the staff and to the families at Scope, do you feel a bit overwhelmed by it? And I say, no, I don't. I actually feel invigorated by it. This is the biggest paradigm shift in social policy that I've seen in my career. And it is one that has huge value to Australia in economic and social terms, and to the people that we support. I think that the organisation that I work for, if I look at it in 5 and 10 years' time, will be a very different organisation. There are some things, however, that won't differ, and that's that we will be a proudly mission-based organisation, that we will still retain at the core of everything that we do the person we support. I think that the sector that I represent has an important value proposition that I'm determined to see will survive in this commercial marketplace. I think that that value proposition is a viable one and an important one to the community as a whole. But I think the organisation will change. We've seen ourselves shift from a block-funded organisation to here in Victoria, individualised support packages, to now what I hope and anticipate will be real choice. I think we are actually building a system. I hearken to Liz Manning's and Liz Cairns' comments around how we know what it will cost going forward. We're actually building that. That has been built in other sectors. If you look at all of the modelling that's been done on chronic disease management, if you look at the modelling that's been done in the Traffic Accident Commission. So we are actually building going forward. We have a strong foundation, but we are building something quite different in my view.
Thank you, Jennifer, and I know you have to go, so many thanks for making the time to come down to us today. If everyone could just thank Jennifer Fitzgerald, the Chief Executive Officer from Scope. Thank you very much. We'll just go to the other panel members for comments, and I guess, Liz Cairns, for you, the next 3 years, there's all eyes on you in many ways. You know, what are you anticipating?
Look, the next 3 years, really, I have described it as a learning lab. It is a learning lab. I'm under no assumptions that what we're doing, how we're structured, the legislation, the assessment protocols that we will have on day one will bear any resemblance, I suspect, to what we had at the end of 3 years, and neither should they. But they are a place to start. There's been a lot of consultation to get to that point of development of all of those things, but they will need to be tested out. I would also like to think and do believe that at the end of the 3 years, certainly in the launch sites, people with disabilities will truly have more choice and control than they have now. That will require a significant investment in sector development, and I use the word sector very broadly in terms of building that capability and capacity.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks again for being able to come to us today at very short notice. Liz Manning, what are you going to be watching, I guess, as disability care comes in over the coming years?
Well, I was going to answer the question from a personal perspective.
Please do.
That's okay. Because I should also mention I do have a personal interest in this because I do have a daughter who's 16 years old and has a very severe cerebral palsy. And for me, what I will be watching is that the things that we're hearing do happen, because I think there's a huge amount of good stuff going on and some terrifically good intentions and some good minds behind all of this. And I'm very hopeful that that will make all the difference for all people with disability. I guess, so I have my personal experience has both informed and motivated me with some of my research here at Deakin. I hope it makes a huge difference to stress levels for family, because it can be almost impossible to have a child with a severe disability. But for my daughter, I hope it does give her that choice and control, so that she doesn't have to wait all that time for a wheelchair, so that she, the funding for her to go out to the movies is not seen as a luxury, it's seen as a right. As she grows older, she has an option for living independently away from us, as I want for my other children. So they're the things I'll be watching, that all those kind of good plans and intentions manage to stay on track. And I think from an economic point of view, there's been a lot of discussion about levy versus cost cuts versus, an increase in the GST or whatever. And there are different arguments that you can make from an economic efficiency point of view. One of the positive things that have come out of this is that I think for the first time in quite a long time, there's been a discussion in Australia about our current tax system and some of the reforms that are really, really necessary. So if at the same time as funding this, we can get some other economic reforms to the tax system, I think that that's a terrific outcome as well. But from a personal perspective, if it does all come in, it's a lifesaver for, and not just for ourselves, but so many times I've been to forums where people have just broken down and cried because they can no longer cope, and there's absolutely no accommodation for their severely autistic grandson and so on. So I think from a human point of view, I hope this will make a huge difference, and it is a huge investment and a huge social change for Australia. And I applaud the people who've been fighting for that.
And one of those people, Philippa Angley, I guess it's been a long, long battle in many ways, but often when you get to this point, there's still a lot more work to do. So what will NDS be focusing on over the coming years?
There is a lot more work to do. NDS is still working closely with governments around some of the design elements for the NDIS. We have the legislation, we've seen draft rules. Some of those finalised rules will be tabled in Parliament any day, and then there are very operating guidelines that we'll be very keen to see those and see how it's actually going to work on the ground. Apart from that, we will be keeping our eye on, making sure the scheme is delivering greater opportunity for people with disability and their families. That's the reason why we've been pushing it so hard. So we won't be taking our eye off that. How we might measure that is going to be one of the interesting things, I think, for the Disability Care Australia, but also service providers, also people with disability themselves, about how they might, measure whether or not this significant investment in disability is actually making an enormous difference. We hope it will. From our members' point of view, our members are not-for-profit organisations, so that we will be keeping our eye on how they're travelling. It will be critically important that the pricing arrangements through the scheme are adequate, and that we do have a sustainable not-for-profit sector. I think many people believe that there are values that come through the not-for-profit sector that we wouldn't like to see get driven out of the market. So we will be watching the pricing issues very, very carefully.
Thanks very much. And finally, Julia Phillips, you mentioned a small agency, but potentially quite a lot of challenges ahead.
Yes, and look, I would like to end on a positive note, although I'll start negative, and that is that I think a lot of us working in the sector are worried that there will be more in terms of numbers and less or the same in terms of quality, because many of us who work in this sector believe that the quality of service provision provided to people with disabilities is substandard at least and dangerous at worst, where people with disabilities are being abused and the safeguards aren't there. One of the things that I'm hoping for is to take advantage of the fact that we will be dealing with an insurance agency, and I'm hoping that they will develop an interest in trying to cut costs by ensuring that there are proactive and effective systems or service providers in place. So, for example, being able to rate service providers who use, I've heard the term evidence-based practices. One very simple thing, it's a difference between people in a house locking someone in a room who's got challenging behaviours, as opposed to getting a behavioural psychologist in doing a functional behaviour assessment and a positive behaviour plan. These things can save money, apart from the human rights perspective, which is obvious. And I'm also very interested in the insurance company being interested in how children leave the education system and what they've turned into by being there. For those of us who don't have personal professional experience with dealing with the education system in Victoria, we can look at the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission report in 2012, the Victorian Auditor General's Office report in 2012. It is a shambles, and I think I can leave it there. But what we're doing is we're churning out people with disabilities who could learn, who leave without the skills to do much at all and go straight into DHS, when instead they could have got a job had they learned to read and write, which they were quite capable of doing so in the first place. Or if they weren't taped to a chair or restrained in a cage and then developed such traumatic psychological problems that they're never going to be the same again. So I'm really interested in hopefully the part that we might usually regard in terms of an insurance agency wanting to cut costs to be used in a way to say, well, how can we actually make sure that the outcomes for people with disabilities are so much better that later on we don't have to spend, they don't need that much money spent on them because they've had some decent quality put into them at the start. Early intervention's not enough because it stops as soon as you go to school, and then there's 10 years of barren wasteland for you. So I'm positive about that, and I urge the organisation to look at ways that it can save money if it wishes to by improving quality of outcomes for people with disabilities.
Thank you.